Hey guys, Jody here. I am super excited to make this video. I just watched a video from a Book Olive's channel, and she explains that November is actually nonfiction November. As somebody who's new to BookTube, I'm super pumped about this. As you know, I read a lot of nonfiction. So don't worry, I have you covered with some recommended nonfiction reads that can attract nonfiction readers. These are tried and true. They are recommendations I make to all of my nonfiction reading friends. And the cool thing is that with Nonfiction November, they also layer in a challenge. So they give you 4 words to associate your reads by. You can get a little creative. Lucky for you, I have 2 recommendations for each of the 4 words. I'll link Olive's video below. She gives you the rundown on what Nonfiction November is and what the 4 words are for 2019. And I'll also list all of my recommendations below as well. But I thought that I would do this video earlier in October so that you had lots of time to go and get your books for Nonfiction November. These are ones that I've read already, and I read nonfiction regularly, so you better believe that I will be reading nonfiction in November. But without further ado, I'll give you the first word. And so the first word is design. I got a little creative with this one. So the first book that I'm recommending, if you haven't read it already, it's pretty popular, is The Big Short by Michael Lewis. Everyone's pretty much heard of this book because it was an awesome movie. And I say an awesome movie because it actually did a really good job of explaining the concept of this book. So if you are wanting to read this book, I highly recommend actually watching the movie, reading the book, and then watching the movie again. The movie does a really good job of explaining some of the more technical sides of the book. I read the book first and then watched the movie, and I actually had to go back and read the book again because there was a bunch of stuff that I just didn't pick up on in the book reading it the first time, especially for those that don't have a finance background. The book can be a little difficult to read, but it's interesting, and especially once you kind of have the characters in your mind from the movie, it makes it really compelling as well. So I definitely recommend The Big Short as my design recommendation. The reason why I've tied it to design is that the book is completely based on the premise of mortgage-backed CDOs, and essentially the Wall Street bankers designed this fund, for lack of a better word, to sell that caused the housing bubble crash thing. It's crazy. Super technical, but that's why I chose it as a design, because I think that it's a cool way to marry in that word with this book. It's all based on the premise of a designed financial fund that blew up and created economic craziness. It's a great book. The second book that I chose for design is Sleeping with the Enemy by Vaughan. This is all about Coco Chanel in France during World War II. It layers in a lot of drama with the elite of the Third Reich, especially during Nazi-occupied France. And then it also ties in a little bit of Winston Churchill. And if you want to know how Churchill is connected to Coco Chanel and occupied France, read the book. I read it really quickly. It's a short read. It's really captivating. And obviously, Coco Chanel is the epitome of fashion design. So those are my design recommendations. The next word is sport. So I have 2 books for sport as well. The first one is called Velocity, and it's a business read. It's by Ajaz Ahmed. I'm so sorry, I butchered that. And Stefan Olander. Stefan Olander actually used to work for Nike. So the book itself is all about digital marketing and the speed with which you need to keep up on the changes in the digital market. So it's a really interesting business read, but I tied it to sport basically because of the tie to Nike and a lot of the examples that they used around Nike as a brand. Obvious correlation, Nike sport. The second one is an interesting one, and this is one of my most favorite books of all times. It's The Devil in the White City by Erik Larson. Erik Larson is a nonfiction genius. He writes the best books. His research is impeccable, at least in my opinion. If I ever get the chance to meet him, I will die happy. But this book it's interesting because it toggles between two concepts. The Chicago World Fair in the 1800s and one of the first major serial killers in America, H.H. Holmes. Apparently there is a movie coming out in the near future where Leo DiCaprio is supposed to play H.H. Holmes, and I'm like waiting on pins and needles for that movie. But the book itself, it toggles between the two storylines. So if you love Chicago and want to learn more about the history of Chicago and specifically the architecture and the World Fair, super interesting. Also, if you like kind of true crime and things of that nature, that's really good as well. I'll do a full review one day on The Devil in the White City because I read it at a really crazy time of my life, and it actually helped me through a crazy situation, which sounds weird, but it'll make sense when I make that video. If you'd like to see it, let me know, and I'll bump it up the priority list. But the reason why I've linked The Devil in the White City to the word sport is because H.H. Holmes basically made it a sport to hunt people down and murder them in like the most craziest ways possible. If you've never read up on H.H. Holmes before, he has something aligned with him dubbed the Murder Mansion. He literally built a mansion in Chicago to house people visiting the World's Fair. It had a kiln in the basement. It had gas chambers in the rooms. Like, this guy was completely messed up. It's so interesting to read, which might make me a little messed up. But, you know, anyways, highly recommend it. It's one of my most favorite reads of all time. And it's my second recommendation for the word sport. The third word is true. So I have two recommendations for the word true. The first one is a book that will be very familiar to people, but if you haven't read it, I highly recommend reading it. It's A Million Little Pieces by James Frey. The reason why I've recommended this book under the word true is because there was a ton of drama about it, specifically with Oprah's book club. So Oprah basically blew up James Frey because he filled in a bunch of holes in his story with what he thought to be true. Basically, it's a book all about the journey through addiction. And obviously, a lot of that time was spent blacked out. So Oprah felt that it wasn't a true memoir or biography because he basically made up 3/4 of the story. In my opinion, there are lots of stories like that. Especially nowadays, like I find that I read memoirs and they're like, this is what I deem to have remembered this as. And there's a whole bunch of research on like memory and how it changes over time and how you can essentially convince yourself that something happened that maybe it didn't. You know, conspiracy theories out there. The Mandela effect is a great one. Not to go down that rabbit hole, but I think that James Frey wrote an amazing book. It's a really quick read. It's very inspiring. I've read a few of his other books, A Friend Named Leonard and Bright Shiny Morning. Bright Shiny Morning is a book about LA. It's also very good, nonfiction, if you're interested, and like his writing style. But A Million Little Pieces, I have recommended it to people who said that they basically blacklisted the book because Oprah blew him up. And then they came back to me and they said, okay, this really wasn't that bad. So give it a try. If you've blacklisted it yourself, really step out of your comfort zone. But the reason why I tied it to true is it true? Is it not true? What do you believe to be true? But I feel like that is a really good recommendation for that word. The second book that I've chosen for the word true is The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher by Kate Summerscale. So I recently read this book. I picked it up at a local flea market, but it reads like a mystery novel. Essentially, it's about a detective back in England before private eye investigators and detectives were a thing, like before Sherlock Holmes. Mr. Witcher, Jack Witcher, was essentially the premise of who Sherlock Holmes is as a character. So it's really cool. It basically goes through his journey. There's tragedy at Road Hill House. One of 4 kids is murdered, and who did it? And it's basically a whodunit through the entire thing. But in the process, this detective, Jack Witcher, gets completely disgraced and falls from grace. But you get lots of references to Charles Dickens. They were actually friends, and a lot of other major detectives of that time. So you might not hear a lot about specifically him because he fell so far from grace because of this specific case. But he is the premise of these characters. So if you love Charles Dickens, if you love old England detective stories, or if you like murder mysteries, this is a great nonfiction read for you. And the ending is predictable, but good. Anyways, so those are my 2 recommendations for the word true. The last word is voice. So I have 2 recommendations for that one as well. The first one is a book called Without You, There Is No Us, and it's by Suki Kim. And it's all about her time teaching kids in North Korea. Obviously, this really ties to voice because the people in North Korea are filtered through propaganda, and the government really restricts their knowledge outside of what they want them to know, or their version of what they want them to know. But the book was actually really interesting because you don't get too many books on North Korea. So that's why I was really interested in reading it. But she goes over her experience of being in the school and what it was like for the kids, and the fact that they don't really have a voice, and the fact that, you know, they're stuck in this world. And you know, we live in this world where information is at our fingertips, and we have things like BookTube and YouTube and Google. These kids don't have that. Like, can you imagine only learning what you're being told to learn, and that's all you know? Yeah. So I thought that that was a really cool one to tie into voice. I found it really interesting. It's almost memoir style. So if you like memoirs, it's a really good recommendation. And then the last book that I have to recommend, and the second book that I'm recommending for voice, is Ghost Boy by Martin Pistorius. This book is a memoir about a gentleman who ends up in a coma, and then he slowly regains consciousness out of his coma, but the people around him don't realize that he's regained his consciousness. And he ends up kind of developing a way to communicate and a way to educate himself. And he's this amazing educator on how to help nonverbal peoples with disabilities communicate. And he's a huge advocate. It's just a remarkable journey that he takes you on. So I definitely recommend it. It's a little bit hard to read at times, but it's, I think, a story that needs to be heard. And anyone who's not familiar with people with nonverbal disabilities, it gives you a little bit of insight as to truly what they're capable of doing and how much they can communicate if we really just take the time and the patience to look for those little cues. It was a really cool book. Anyways, so there's a ton of recommendations there. Some really, really, really awesome reads. I promise that you will not find any of these books boring, and you will walk away having learned something, feeling something, and it ties into the 4 challenge words. I'm really excited about Nonfiction November. I hope you guys let me know how you like the recommendations if you end up reading any of them. And I don't know what I'm going to be reading for Nonfiction November yet. So if you have any recommendations that I haven't listed here, please let me know, because you know I'll be reading nonfiction in November. Anyways, we'll talk soon, guys. Have a great October. Bye.